And this is a video talking about the relationships, the cardinality of relationships and constraints associated with cardinality of relationships. As you can see, relationships amongst entities can be complex. So we're going to talk through a couple of these topics here. Again, this is not an exhaustive lecture on this, but this is to cover the basics. So, relationships. You can have a one-to-one relationship. So you can have two entities that are related one-to-one. And you may say, well, you know, why would I have a relationship like that? Believe me, there are various reasons that you would have a relationship. A good example would be personally identifiable information. So now I've got employees, but I don't want to store their date of birth and their social security number in an entity that everyone's going to have access to. So in one entity of employees, I have their names, their addresses, you know, basically pretty much public information. And then in another entity, I would have employee private information, and that I would have their social security number and their date of birth. That's an example. One-to-many is the most common. Most of the entities, if not all of the entities in your project, are probably going to be one-to-many type relationships amongst the entities. And then there are many-to-many. And we'll talk about those again because we actually have to get rid of any many-to-many relationships from our entity relationship diagram in order to support that in a database management system. The next thing we want to talk about are constraints. So the constraints associated, there's what's known as cardinality. So you have minimum cardinality and you have maximum cardinality. So for instance, in a previous video we talked about employees and courses. So if I can have an employee and that employee can exist without ever taking a course, then that is an optional minimum cardinality. If all of my employees have to be enrolled in at least one course, then that changes the minimum cardinality to mandatory, so that I cannot have an employee that's not taking a course. The maximum cardinality is the easier one. Can an employee take many courses? And if that's the case, then the maximum is many. And can a course be associated with multiple employees? In other words, can many employees take a particular course? And if that's the case, then that's the many. So we have minimum and maximum cardinality. So with those two concepts, we can move on to looking at the cardinalities and their degrees associated with unary relationships. So now we have one entity that is related to itself. So we have a person that is also married to another person. In this case, that is a one-to-one relationship. Okay, if we go to the one-to-many, an employee can manage multiple employees. So in that case, we have a one-to-many. And then we can have another example of a team stands after another team. So that's, again, a one-to-one relationship. Then we have binary relationships where an employee can be assigned to a parking space. So there's an example of a one-to-one. An employee can only have one parking space. A student can register for many courses, and a course can have many students registered for it. That's a many-to-many. And then the one-to-many is the product line to the product. So any given product line can be associated with many products. So these are binary relationships. And we've got an example of a ternary relationship where we've got a vendor, we've got vendors, we've got parts, we've got a warehouse, and then the relationship is supplies, and supplies as a relationship has its own attributes, those being shipping mode and unit cost. So you can see the example is that vendor X supplies part C to warehouse Y with a shipping mode of next day air and a unit cost of $5. So in this case, a relationship can have attributes of its own, and a vendor to part to warehouse is all many to many to many. That's actually a ternary relationship. Then we have cardinality constraints. So now we're talking about mandatory. So a patient, in this case, you can't have patient history without having a patient, and a patient can't exist without patient history. And this is easily displayed by making an instance diagram. So we have Mark has to have a visit. Sarah can have multiple visits, right? So you can see how you can set up mandatory cardinalities. When we have one optional and one mandatory, we can see that we can have an employee, but an employee doesn't have to be associated with a project. On the other hand, a project must be assigned to at least one employee, and may be assigned to many. So here we've got the combination of the minimum cardinality along with the maximum cardinality. Then we have optional cardinalities. So we have people, right? So we have a person, and that person in this unary relationship can be married to another person, but doesn't have to be. But if they are, they're only married to one person. That's not, obviously that's not a universal rule, but that's the rule here. Then we get into departments and employees. So here again we have multiple, this is an example where we have multiple relationships between entities. So here we've got employee. An employee can supervise many employees. An employee can be supervised by one supervisor. So see how that works. We can have an employee that works in many departments. A department that has workers. We can have an employee manage a department, and we can have a department that is managed by an employee. So we can have entities related to each other in more than one way. Pardon me. So we have examples of multiple relationships. Here we've got a professor that's qualified to teach a course, and we have courses that are qualified to be taught by multiple professors. And in here, you'll notice a new identifier where the minimum cardinality constraint, where it's usually either a 0 or a hash mark. In this case, the hash mark has a 2, denoting the fact that at least 2 professors must be qualified to teach each course. And then we have schedule. And in this case, schedule is what we call an associative entity, but we'll touch on that more in the next video. So here we have an example that we have an attribute of an entity can also be set up as, can take an attribute and set it up as an entity and set up relationships. So in this case, we have a course that may have a list of prerequisites. And we could make the decision to break that out and say that a prerequisite is an entity in and of itself. And then we can say the course has prerequisites, or the course is a prerequisite for another course. It depends on how we want to set that up. So that's an example of a simple. And then if we have a composite attribute, as we have on the bottom here, we have an employee that has many skills. We can set up 3 entities. We can set up one entity that lists all the skills. We can have another entity that lists the employees. And then our associative entity, which again, I will explain more later, would keep track of the skills that are associated with each employee. So that's another way of doing that. And that will end our discussion on attributes and their and relationships and their types.